Katie Herzog, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Yascha.
I've known your writing for a long time. I listen to your podcast with Jesse Single often. But you have a new book out that is personal in a different kind of way. And it tells the story of you becoming an alcoholic and managing to move beyond that. And managing to move beyond that in a way that's somewhat surprising, perhaps, to people. How, in your case, do you think the alcoholism started? I mean, how do you go from drinking socially to hang out with friends to suddenly it becoming a problem?
So it happened gradually. I started drinking young. I'm not a Gen Zer, so it was normal in my milieu to start drinking in high school or really younger. I had my first drinks when I was in middle school.
I'm European, so I started to drink at the age of 5. I mean,
right. You were weaned on wine. So I started young, and that's one of the risk factors for developing alcohol use disorder or alcoholism. People sometimes bristle at the term, but alcoholism, but I don't have a problem with it. So that's one of the risk factors. Another one is a family history of alcohol abuse. I come from like Irish Catholic people, so there's some alcoholism in my blood. And then I also drank a lot. So there are other risk factors. Trauma is one of them. I don't have any trauma, at least that I'm willing to admit in public.
To yourself or to the world, yes.
Yes.
A trauma-free individual, that's a special
Yeah, I think so.
today.
Although I sort of go with the old school definition of the term trauma. I'm not talking about people yelling at me online and things like that.
I'm traumatized every time I open the newspaper.
Yes, every time I open Twitter, which is why I don't do it anymore. So that's what happened. These 3 risk factors, I basically hit each one of those. And so while I started, I drank a lot in college. It was very social. But it was also sort of antisocial, even in college. So I loved, when I was 19, 20 years old, I loved nothing more than to sit on my porch by myself, reading The New Yorker and drinking alone. I loved it. That was, if I could spend my life doing that. Honestly, without the negative side effects, I probably would still be doing that.
And the only thing that's changed since then is that The New Yorker has really gone down the drains.
Yes, my subscription has lapsed. I also no longer drink, but losing The New Yorker might have been more painful. And then, as I aged, I really aged into bar culture. So by the time I was in my early 20s, I was drinking, 4:00 in the afternoon at a bar with mostly older men, like retired and out of work men, and women, some women as well. The alcoholism, it's not really sex-based. And, as my peers who were my own age, sort of, a lot of them naturally aged out of that pattern of behavior, and I just never did. And I was hoping that I would, and most people do. There's a phenomenon that you don't hear about that much in recovery centers or in AA meetings or places like that, but there's this phenomenon called natural recovery. Most people who binge drink in college just age out of it as life changes. Life gets in the way of their drinking.
And part of that is that obviously I want to get into what actually defines alcoholism or alcohol use disorder in your mind. But one definition or part of the definition that seems intuitive to me is that, it becomes a problem when it distracts from positive elements in your life and when it presents a problem. When you're at an age where in college, hopefully you're actually reading the assigned texts for the classes I teach and doing all kinds of other things. But obviously a lot of a culture of college, and that's part of the point of college is to meet friends and create a social network and hang out with each other. And so, if in college there's 3 or 4 nights a week where you're out of people drinking, that doesn't necessarily distract from what those years are supposed to be for, and it certainly doesn't stand out relative to your peers, right? And so I guess the question is, as you're going from that to a different life circumstance, do you continue to engage in this behavior to change behavior?
Yeah. I not only continued to engage in it, my drinking accelerated greatly. So drinking did get in the way of my college somewhat. I couldn't, just things like the choices that I made. So I never took morning classes, never. And that's something that lots of students do. But even something like that, choosing my major based on, on having noon lectures rather than 8 a.m. lectures, it did influence all of my choices. The places where I lived, I knew that I needed to live within walking distance of bars, because otherwise, this is before Uber, right? So otherwise I would be at risk for drinking and driving, which I knew was going to be an issue. So it really influenced sort of large and small decisions I made in sort of the trajectory of my life. But after college, and I also dropped out of college for a while, in part because of my drinking and because of things that happened while I was drinking. But then as I, after
but before we get to what happened next, I mean, when we go back to that time and we get 21-year-old Katie, who's obviously very smart and reflective and so on, and somebody says, hey, I know you pretty well. I feel like perhaps your drinking is a problem. What at the time would you have said? Was there some part of you that knew that and believed it? Was there no part of you that knew and believed that? What did you admit to yourself, and what would you have admitted to a close friend at the time?
So at 21, no. At 21, I had no idea that my drinking was anything out of the ordinary. And in fact, my drinking was not out of the ordinary at 21. I lived in very boozy towns and very boozy communities. I was completely normal. The difference is that I just never stopped. As my friends, as we graduated and moved away, and my friends got careers and families and bought homes, I was really stuck in that pattern of behavior. And even then, though, I'll say my behavior wasn't abnormal because the community that I was in was still very boozy. We weren't 21, we were 25, 27, 30, 35, 50, but still, I was a bar person. I hung out in bars. Everyone around me was the same.
And so, when do you think most of your peers started to grow out of this behavior and you didn't? And what to you were the warning signs that, hang on a second, this thing that seemed to me to be adaptive, seemed to me to be a fun part of my life, actually perhaps is holding me back in serious ways?
So that also was gradual. My peers from college, I think they were a little bit more ambitious. After college, most of them, moved away and started jobs or went to grad school. And I lost touch with a lot of them. And I think that most of them sort of, at that point, most of them, not all, but most of them really did kind of get their shit together and start drinking normally. But I didn't. So I moved after college. I moved to Oregon and lived there for a couple of years and was working in coffee shops and places like that. And so, my friends were musicians and artists. And so within that community, what I was doing was completely normal. My first realization that I had a problem was I think I was about 24, and I was going through my first really serious breakup. And the sort of short version of the story is that my girlfriend at the time, who I lived with, it was a serious relationship. Basically, I treated on her. I treated her really poorly. And she found out because this was the MySpace days. And she read a MySpace.
Wait, how's MySpace related to finding out?
She read a message. She read a MySpace message.
Oh, I see.
Where I was like confessing this behavior to a friend of mine, a drinking friend of mine. And she came I had just gotten a job at a bakery, and she came to the bakery where I worked, and she said, "You fucking liar," and she slapped me in the face. And then so within the span of a day, I lost my girlfriend, my job, and my house. And that was my first sort of like, oh, there's a problem moment, because, and not just because my life had fallen apart, but because I was really confronted with the fact that I had done something truly wrong, and I had done it to someone that I truly loved. And so why did I do this? What was wrong with me? And my options were, as I saw it, I was either a bad person, a sociopath even, or I had a drinking problem, because my behavior was connected to drinking. Yeah. And in some ways, I would have rather had been a sociopath, because sociopaths don't have to quit drinking. And the last thing I wanted was to quit drinking. So that was my first sort of aha moment.
But is that a kind of poignant retrospective gloss, or is that something you thought of at the time? Like, do you really think it's either this or that? And
yes.
And like, hopefully I'm a sociopath. I mean, that feels, I believe I'm neither of those two things. But to think of yourself as a sociopath seems like such a radical self-indictment.
So the thing about addiction is that it's such a powerful force that I wanted any excuse to continue to drink. And if in facing the realization that I had a really serious drinking problem was absolutely devastating and destabilizing in a way that I have not experienced since. And this was 20 years ago almost. And so after that, so I had this realization, and I actually went to a psychiatrist. Like in that moment I knew, but I went to a psychiatrist because I didn't want to be diagnosed with sociopathy, but I went to a psychiatrist and he diagnosed me as bipolar 1. This was a complete misdiagnosis. I'm not bipolar. And bipolar 1 is the bad one, or the fun one, however you look at it. I'm not bipolar. This is a complete misdiagnosis. I had a drinking problem, but my behavior from the outside looked bipolar.
And it's because you were one personality when you were sober and another when you were drunk.
I engaged in really high-risk behaviors when I was drinking. And I was depressed because alcohol is depressant. It wreaks havoc on your brain. So I did have some of the symptoms of an actual, serious mental illness, but it was a complete misdiagnosis. And probably part of me was hiding what I was doing because I didn't want him to tell me, you have to quit drinking. Instead, he did tell me I should quit drinking, but he also prescribed me a mood stabilizer, which I took for a few months and then just stopped taking. It really had no long-term or even short-term effects on me. But so after that first realization, I had this, aha moment, a terrible one. And over the next decade and a half, really, I lived with the knowledge that I was an alcoholic, but there's a term that I think describes this really well, vacillating denial. So sometimes I knew I was a drunk, like late at night when I woke up at 3:00 in the morning with, night sweats and my head pounding and just radiating shame. I knew I was a drunk. At 5:00 the next day, when I wanted a drink, I'm not thinking I'm an alcoholic. I'm thinking I just want a drink. So I was able to live with this cognitive dissonance, knowing sometimes that I had a drinking problem and knowing I needed to quit, but also being so unable to quit that I just ignored it for years. I ignored it like I had accepted this truth, but I continued to drink despite knowing this truth. And again, because I lived in heavy drinking communities, this was completely normal. I was surrounded by alcoholics.
Well, one of the things that strikes me in my personal experience with friends and acquaintances that have problems with using alcohol, sometimes perhaps that have a tenuous hold on reality, sometimes who have a drug abuse problem, that there are certain communities that valorize those kind of behaviors, right?
Completely.
The kind of relatively straightforward one is like, oh, this is a really fun person. They're always up for going out and it's always a laugh and a good time to be around them, right? In more extreme cases, it can be artists who are valorized partially for their extreme behavior and their odd personalities, which actually are rooted in drug abuse, for example. And so then obviously, I worry about the cultures of those communities because they encourage that behavior. But of course, the other way around, people who have those problems are drawn to those communities because those communities give you cover for that behavior.
100%. Absolutely. So before we started recording, you said something about me being an introvert. I am an introvert. I admit to that fully. When I was 25 years old, nobody who knew me would have called me an introvert. I was the life of the party. I was wild. I was always down to go out. I was fun, unpredictable, completely unrecognizable to my life now. I went to bars. I went to party every day. I did this every day for years of my life. I was so social and I had a lot of friends. And all of that was connected to drinking.
And do you think that the introversion is connected to that? I don't mean by that, but it's generally connected. It would surprise me if introverts in general were more likely to be alcoholics. If anything, perhaps extroverts like me might be more likely to end up as alcoholics because you are in more social situations. It's easier to end up drinking too much, etc. But perhaps in your particular case, there's a kind of link between being introvert, but seeking that social stimulation and friendship, and the way you can get yourself to sustain it is that you need alcohol as a lubricant to be social in those kind of ways.
Yeah, I think that was a huge part of it. And the thing about it is that so much of my socialization happened from a young age under this sort of cloud of alcohol that it was when I quit drinking eventually, when I knew that I needed to quit drinking, one of the things that was so terrifying about this was that I thought that it would be impossible for me to be social. I genuinely thought it would be impossible to have a good time, to have any fun at all if I wasn't drinking, because I had literally never done it before. Drinking was it was every part of my life was connected to alcohol. And so the idea of going to a dinner party or a show or anything without alcohol was unthinkable. I have realized now that it's actually fine. People do it every day. Not everyone needs to get loaded to have a good time. It's actually fine. But at the time, it was completely unimaginable.
You were talking earlier about this term of vacillating denial. I think you were talking mostly about how it felt within your own brain. During this period of vacillating denial, was there times when you would admit to what you saw as a problem to confidants and family members and friends, or it was just within your own mind you kind of had moments of, I kind of know I actually have this problem, but you would sort of refuse to acknowledge it to others. And there must have been moments when friends or family members or romantic partners told you, hey, I think you have a problem. How did you respond to that? Or perhaps that never happened.
It never happened. Not a single time. I was very good at hiding my drinking, very good at it, to the point where a lot of people who I was close to didn't know that I had a drinking problem, because I was really good at hiding it. And
you were good at hiding the fact of drinking, or you were good at hiding the drinking affecting you or needing to drink, or all of those things?
All of it. And so in my heaviest drinking years, I would have conversations with other friends who also, in retrospect, it was very obvious, had drinking problems. A lot of them have now quit drinking. We would have these conversations, but it was all sort of cloaked in humor. And no one took it seriously. And on the rare occasions when someone did get sober within my friend group, I was appalled. I thought of it as like a sort of betrayal.
You betrayed.
Yes. And, I was very judgmental of people who didn't drink, didn't understand them, didn't want to be around them. Yeah, and that was fairly normal within my community.
It is interesting because we think about the stigma of alcoholism, and that does exist. But there is also the stigma of being a teetotaler. And I drank a good amount when I was younger, I guess, but young, I have to admit. At this point, I really don't drink very much. But there are social situations where, you're meeting somebody at 6 p.m., you don't really want to have a drink, but it feels a little bit rude not to have a drink.
Totally.
Because it feels like you're not committing to that social occasion. It feels like, their company is not worth the investment of perhaps sleeping a little bit less well and perhaps being a tiny little bit hungover the next day. And so sometimes, I find it difficult to not order a drink in those circumstances purely out of this kind of social stigma against not drinking in a particular situation.
Right. And you want to do what the person next to you is doing, right? If you go to dinner with somebody, with a group of people, and one person doesn't eat, it just seems strange. And alcohol
Well, but it's weird because, I mean, if I go to dinner with somebody and they're really sanctimonious about being a vegan, then I find it annoying. But if I go to dinner with someone, I order a steak and they order the salad, I don't care.
Right.
Where somehow it does feel like if I meet somebody at 6 p.m., and they order a beer and I say, could I have a sparkling water? It somehow feels like, not a disrespect towards them, but a disrespect towards the social situation.
Well, I think it can also be a little bit of a signifier that you don't drink for a reason. And so it leads to a follow-up question. Why don't you drink? Which, most people probably aren't going to ask, but they might wonder.
Yeah, it's funny. That's not the fear I have. I think the fear I have is a sense of sort of, it communicates, I want to be done with this meeting quickly, or I don't think you're sufficiently important to me to...
I'm not going to waste a hangover on you.
Yeah, exactly. Something like that. Yeah. So you're very good at not letting people notice that. Now, part of that, of course, is that you have your life together in a way that some people who are dependent on alcohol don't, right? A lot of people, I mean, perhaps you're just sneakier than everybody else and cleverer than everybody else, and you're certainly very clever. But it feels to me, if you're able to hide your alcoholism in a way that a lot of people are not, it's in part because you continue to be professionally successful. You do keep a relationship during that period. So, you develop ways in which the alcohol dependency negatively impacted your life, but it didn't totally make your life derail. Why do you think that is? Or what sort of stood between you and the people whose lives are just completely destroyed by that disease?
So it did destroy my life for many years. So until I was about 30, I worked mostly minimum wage, entry-level jobs. This was, however, this was long enough ago that rent was still cheap in most American cities. So I could afford to still pay my rent even if I was working part-time or working minimum wage jobs, or I had roommates.
Living the dream of the 90s in
Yes.
Oregon, yes.
Yeah, or early 2000s, but yes, still cheap. So I was still able to live in a way that was pretty hedonistic and irresponsible, and still manage to pay rent. And so that's how I spent my 20s. Honestly, my 20s are very much a blur. And I did that until I was really into when I was 30, I was working as a copy editor at a small academic publishing house, again, working part-time. And I left my job to get an unpaid internship at the age of 30. And that was really the beginning of trying to get my shit together. So I did have a really delayed adolescence, or really prolonged adolescence, I suppose. And then after that, I started on a career path. I made better decisions, but I wasn't drinking every night. I also kept moving. So I've lived in a bunch of different places, and that was always sort of one of my coping mechanisms. Like if my drinking accelerated to the point where it was becoming very problematic, I would leave the community that I was in, leave the environment, which was actually worked pretty well for a while. And then eventually, that I would adopt the same habits in a new place. But so I basically until my 30s, I was like just like every other loser at the bar. And then I started to get my shit together. And then but the time you got your shit together was not directly correlated with the time when you actually quit drinking, right? That came later. No. So I moderated my drinking for a couple of years. I got this internship. I moved to a new city. I got a job, my first job in media, working in public radio. And I would drink on the weekends. So I was very regimented about when I would allow myself to drink. So I would do it during the weekends, but not during the weekend. On the weekends, I would go back to my old town and I would sleep on my friend's futon and party all weekend. And then I would leave. And then I moved across the country. I moved to Seattle. Similar patterns where I was really able to keep it to the weekends for the most part. And for the book, I interviewed a ton of problem drinkers. And, we have sort of the stereotype of the alcoholic as maybe a guy living under a bridge or whatever who beats his wife and ends up getting DUIs and in prison. Although I guess most people living under bridges these days are probably more likely fentanyl addicts than drinking wine out of a paper bag. But there's, this would surprise nobody to know, but it is very possible to be an alcoholic and have a career and have a family. And it is detrimental for sure. I think especially if you start drinking young, you can kind of get emotionally and mentally stuck in your, developmentally in your 20s or teens even. That definitely happens. But people manage to live these sort of bifurcated lives where you're hungover at work, but you're still doing your job, and then you get off work and you drink. It's pretty common.
Well, sort of the madman style alcoholism rather than the fully out of control style alcoholism.
Functional alcoholic. There's a term for it for a reason. Yeah.
So there's periods when it really wrecks your life. Where there's periods when you have your life more or less together, even though it continues to negatively impact you. That makes it sound like you could easily have gone through your whole life without either becoming, the person drinking wine out of a bag under a bridge, or really getting the problem under control, really grappling with the fact that you have a problem. What, after these years of vacillating acceptance and denial of a problem, of better years and worse years, made you confront it in a different kind of way?
COVID. So during COVID, I was laid off. I was working at the Stranger, Seattle's Alt Weekly, and I took a furlough really early on. I basically volunteered as soon as COVID hit, and the newspaper was, it's a free paper. It was all of our paychecks were paid by ads for things like events, which were no longer happening. And so it was pretty obvious pretty quickly that things were going to go downhill really quickly. And so I volunteered to take a furlough.
You were also the most popular employee of The Stranger, for That's a Different Story.
Yeah. I was like, not coming into work and seeing these assholes for a few months, I'll take it. So I went on furlough. I started collecting unemployment, which I loved. It was like maybe my fifth or sixth time on unemployment. I've never been afraid to take our meager social safety net up on its offerings. And so I was at home. My wife is a nurse, and I was at home by myself a lot because it was COVID. She was working a lot, and Jesse and I had started this podcast, but for the most part, at the beginning of the show, it didn't take much work. There was so much happening in the culture that we would just sort of get on the mic and talk to each other for an hour about whatever we were seeing. Now the show has really changed and there's a lot of structure, but at the time, it really didn't take much prep. And so I just had a ton of time on my hands, and I just drank. I drank during the day. The time that I started drinking got early and earlier, so at some point I was drinking in the morning. And this was completely in secret. Nobody knew about it, including my wife. And I did this for 2 years. So basically every time my wife went to work, I got loaded and I spent all day just sitting on my porch, drinking and scrolling and sort of watching from the sidelines as it felt like the world was falling apart. Not just because of COVID, but because of everything that was happening. And I knew, I felt terrible. I looked terrible, just racked with guilt and shame constantly. And I started having health effects, right? So waking up at 3:00 in the morning, every morning, just like with the shakes, with night sweats, having a pounding headache every morning, telling myself the next day that today will be different. Today I'm not going to drink. And then, around 11 o'clock noon, it was like this switch just flipped in my brain, and almost without even being conscious of it, I was out the door on my way to go buy booze. And I started there are things that I think many problem drinkers, like lines that we tell ourselves we're not going to cross. I'm not going to drink in the morning. I'm not going to drunk drive. I'm not going to hide it. And pretty soon I had crossed a lot of those lines for myself. And it was going to kill me at some point. Like the amount that I was drinking, the amount that I was drinking at the time, I was drinking basically like 6 tall boys, like 6 pints of cheap beer a day. So much less than I was in sort of my heavy drinking days of my 20s when I could drink twice that in a day. But still, it's a lot of liquid. It's a lot of empty calories. I looked like shit. I felt like shit. And the worst part about addiction for me has always been the amount of brain space it takes up. So besides all of the health, the like physical health effects, for me, I think the best way to explain it to people who haven't ever been addicted to something is the feeling that you get when you're like newly in love with someone or you have a crush on someone, and it's so overwhelming to you, especially when you're younger, and it's so overwhelming to you that that's all that you can think about. Or maybe like, your mom has a cancer diagnosis or something, and that's the only thing that you can think about. That's what alcohol was for me for so long. It just took up all of my brain space. And one of the things that made it hard to get sober, and I had tried over the years to get sober. I'd done AA, I'd done group therapy, I'd done individual therapy, CBT and CBD. I tried lots of things. Nothing ever stuck long
CBT
time.
and CBD is great.
I tried it all. One of the things that made it so difficult to get sober long term was that the messages that I had absorbed about sobriety and recovery was that once you're an alcoholic, you have to quit drinking forever. Like they say it's one day at a time in AA, but really everybody knows it's forever. And I couldn't conceptualize a life without alcohol. And so having that in my brain and knowing that the only way out of this was to give up this thing that was absolutely destroying me, but that I also was completely dependent on and that I hated, but I also loved, was such a mental barrier that it kept me drinking just for years, drinking in secret, drinking more and more all the time, to the point where it really was taking over my life in a way that was very destructive. And I was, I never beat my wife, like nothing like that. But I was just distracted all the time. I was, a shitty partner. I was lying to my wife. Just small things like, my wife, we live an hour from Seattle. She takes a ferry. If she was coming home from work and it was after a certain time of day, I couldn't pick her up at the boat. I was going to be drunk. Just things like that where I'm like, all right, you got to take the bus. Sorry, I've got a meeting. I don't have a meeting. I'm actually
right.
Drunk,
You're making excuses for not going to pick her up. And it's not that you didn't want to render that act of service to somebody you loved. It's just that it would have
killed her if I picked her up. Yeah, like making all of my decisions around drinking, scheduling my life around drinking, like with Jesse, with the podcast. I still am a control freak, but I was very regimented about when I was willing to record, because if we record at afternoon, I'm going to be loaded and I don't want to record the podcast drunk. So being completely inflexible about my routine, because my routine, I knew I was going to be drinking. I needed these hours to do it, and I knew nothing could be scheduled during that time. Don't tell Jesse, by the way.
He never listens to any podcast, so it's fine. He certainly wouldn't listen to mine. One of the really interesting things about your book is that you combine your personal story with an interesting argument about how we think about addiction, how we think about overcoming addiction. And so I just want to plant the seed at this point of the conversation, because you mentioned that one of the things that kept you from seeking help, you sought various forms of help, but to really try and overcome this problem, is that you felt like if you stopped drinking, then it's forever and you couldn't conceive of a life without alcohol. Tell us a little bit about the kind of dominant frame for what somebody in the situation you were in during COVID should be doing, and the role that AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, plays in that, both in terms of medical establishment, but also in terms of our culture more broadly.
Yeah, so this is changing. The first time I went to AA and the first time I approached a professional about my drinking I was 24. This was in, I think, 2007. And at the time, and then for many years before and since, there was basically, a couple of modalities or treatment programs for somebody who presents with a drinking problem: rehab and 12-step programs. And that was pretty much it. And when I was writing the book, I learned the history of AA, and it's pretty fascinating. So AA was sort of an organic peer support group that was developed by two guys in the 1930s. But the reason that AA became so dominant in the culture was because of one of the reasons was because of an early member, a woman actually. Her name is Marty Mann. And she was a PR whiz. She was very connected in publishing in Hollywood, and she made it. AA saved her life, and she made it her. And AA at the time was not hospitable to women, but she was early member, and it saved her life. And so she basically made it her mission to preach the gospel of AA throughout the land, and was incredibly successful at this. And AA has saved so many lives. I really don't knock AA. It really works for a lot of people. And
what's, for people who don't know as much about it, what's the basic model of AA?
So it's a peer support group. It's you go to a meeting, at open meetings anybody is welcome, but you go to a meeting and you basically listen to people. You sit in a circle or around a table, and in this sort of kind of regimented way, people talk about what's going on. And there's not a lot of like back and forth. That's called crosstalk. That's not encouraged, not even really allowed. But you at the beginning of the meeting, you go through this sort of process. Everybody sort of speaks the same words. There's these traditions, these rituals. When it's time to speak, you say, "My name is Katie and I'm an alcoholic." So there's these norms within the group. A lot of people get a sponsor within the group, and the sponsor is the person that you call when you're having problems. You work the steps. There are 12 steps, starting with admitting that you are powerless and ending with basically going forth and helping other alcoholics. So it's a process, right? If you do it right, you don't just go and sit at the meetings. You actually work the steps and you become a part of the community. And there have been peer support groups for much longer than AA. AA was not the first at all, but it's certainly the most successful, at least in terms of membership. And for almost 100 years, that's been the dominant paradigm for how people get sober. And that includes in rehab. So AA is free. That's one of the amazing benefits of it, right? There are AA meetings in every city and town in America and many all over the world. There are also now meetings on Zoom, largely because of COVID. So anybody can go to AA who thinks they might have a problem. And there is something very powerful about being in the company of other addicts who understand what you're going through. They can also be really fun. Like addicts are great storytellers. It's like an open mic, right? So you'll hear these great stories. Oftentimes you'll hear the same stories from the same people over and over again. But it's a community. And that, I think, especially for people who are in the midst of addiction, having community accountability, support, and a place to go can be really valuable. And that model has infiltrated sounds negative. I don't mean it as negative, but lots of rehab programs also rely on these peer support groups, these 12-step principles within AA. And there's it is a little bit ironic because rehab can be incredibly expensive, but the therapy that they provide sometimes is like the shit that you can get for free at your local AA meeting. But one of the sort of, there's a lot of, I think, misconceptions about AA. So people think that AA, preaches that alcoholism is a personal failure. It's not. It's more nuanced than that, right? And the founders of AA, particularly Bill Wilson, he was a very open-minded guy. He was experimenting with psychedelics in the 1950s. But AA has become incredibly dominant throughout the culture, so that it's not just something that everybody has heard of. It's something that courts can mandate that if you get a DUI or you get in trouble with the law, that you go to AA. Professional licensing organizations can mandate that somebody who has a drinking problem, like I've been to AA meetings recently where there were 2 pharmacists there, and they weren't there because they wanted to be there. They were there because they got in trouble at work and they needed to fulfill these requirements in order to keep their license. If you come out of prison and you need a place to live and you end up in a halfway house, AA can be mandated as part of that sort of recovery process. So it really has become dominant. The problem is that it just doesn't work for everybody.
And why doesn't it work for everybody? And just to draw that out, part of the assumption in AA is that the goal is not to drink at all. Yes. Right? The goal is not get to a healthy relationship with alcohol where you can toast your partner's birthday with a glass of champagne. Right. The idea is that, people will have relapses and there's not going to be judgment about that, but the goal is to not drink at all. Yes.
So within AA, the doctrine of AA, any slip up any drink is considered a slip. And that's, you sort of start the counter back to zero. So you could have had 12 years sober and you go and you have a sip of champagne at your daughter's wedding and you got to start the clock right over. I personally find that not very helpful. It's this sort of all or nothing attitude, and anything less than perfect is considered a failure. And I think that in itself keeps people away from the program, especially people who aren't totally sure that they're like, if you know that drinking is causing a problem in your life, but you're not totally ready to quit, or you can't conceptualize a world without alcohol, and the one option that you've been given or that you've been told about is to never have another sip of alcohol again, it's just going to keep some people drinking longer than they should. And that was my experience. If these were the 2 options, total complete abstinence or a life of drinking, even though it's causing problems in my life, I was going to choose the life of drinking.
And so why did that not happen? because clearly you have ended up in a situation where it's not one of those two options, it's a third option. How did you realize there could be a third option, and how were you able to escape the situation?
So it was an article in The Atlantic. This article came out in 2015. It was by Gabrielle Glasser, and it was called The Irrationality of Alcoholics Anonymous. Now, that article is about sort of about the problems with AA, but there was a part of it that mentioned this treatment called the Sinclair method. And the Sinclair method it's medication-assisted therapy. It was developed by an American researcher named John David Sinclair. And to sort of simplify it, he developed this protocol where a person takes an opioid blocker, typically naltrexone. In other places, it's an opioid blocker called nalphamine or some other opioid blocker. And you continue to drink as normal with this opioid blocker in your system. And so that opioid blocker, naltrexone, it basically prevents your brain from getting an endorphin rush and a dopamine dump, indirectly flooded with dopamine, when you drink alcohol. And the idea is you do this over time. You do this over months, maybe years even for some people. And gradually you retrain your brain not to enjoy alcohol because your brain isn't getting...
It's not getting what it wants from it.
Exactly. It makes drinking boring. And so I read that article. I read this, I think in 2018 or so, and I read this article and I thought, okay, this is what I've been looking for. This is the solution to my problems. And I went to my doctor and I brought this article to my doctor, and she had never heard of the Sinclair method, which is very common. I don't think most doctors have. Lots of them have heard of naltrexone, and that's increasingly true as medical education has embraced things like harm reduction and medication-assisted therapy for substance use disorder. But my doctor had never heard of the Sinclair method, so I brought her this article, and I said, this is what I want to do, and she said, okay, do it. So I got the drug, and I went home. I got a can of beer from the store, from the corner store on the way home, and I took the drug, and I felt like shit. I just felt awful. I got side effects, headache, nausea. I felt depressed. I really didn't like it, and I sort of choked down this can of beer, and I thought, okay, I was so hopeful. I was so hopeful that this seemed like a miracle cure, right? The thing that would allow me to keep drinking, but diminish my enjoyment of it. Because what I was afraid of for years, the thing that kept me drinking, one of the things that kept me drinking longer than I should, was I didn't want to live in a state of unfulfilled desire for the rest of my life. And that's what I thought sobriety would be. I was always
going... Right, this constant hankering for the thing you can't have,
yes.
and this constant self-denial.
I still am, like, very bad at fighting cravings for anything. If I want a cookie, I'm eating a cookie. I don't have much willpower when it comes to giving in to my own impulses.
You didn't pass the marshmallow test?
No, definitely. I would be eating the whole bag. And so so I was looking for a solution that would extinguish not just the drinking itself, but the desire to drink. And that's what I hoped that this would do. And then the first time I took the drug, I thought, no, I can't do this. This is not for me. So I put the drug away, and it sat in my medicine cabinet for another several years until COVID, until I sort of really needed anything. And I thought, I'm going to try this one more time, or I'm going to have to fess up to my wife and probably I'm going to have to go to rehab, and that's going to fuck up the podcast because I'm going to have to leave for 30 days. And then I'm going to have to do intensive outpatient therapy. It's going to completely derail my life. So I'll just try this one other thing before I fess up and blow my life up. And I didn't.
And why was the second time different? What is it that the first time round either physically led to the side effects or just mentally made you not prepared to deal with the side effects? And why is it that the second time you were able to use this method?
I think a big part of it is that I armed myself with information. So I read everything I could find about the Sinclair method. I prepared myself to deal with the side effects. And there are simple things to do, like start out at a standard dose is 50 milligrams. So start out at a quarter of a pill, start out at 12.5 milligrams and work your way up. I had a full meal the first time I ate it. I drank a full glass of water. Some people take over-the-counter nausea medications. One thing that's interesting about this is I was not getting this information from my doctor. I was getting this information from Facebook and Reddit and YouTube. My doctor had never heard of this, right? And so I was just prepared. I knew about the side effects. I was prepared to handle them. And I also knew that this was kind of last chance before I have to really blow up my life. And I was willing to take some discomfort if that meant that I could not, and I didn't have to tell my wife, basically. And didn't have to go to rehab, and didn't have to go to AA, and didn't have to quit drinking. And so that was the plan. I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna try this again. I researched it so much. I talked to people. I kept a Substack where I was writing about this under a pseudonym. And I treated it sort of like a journalism project.
To ask a really simple and perhaps a stupid question, if your brain craves the feeling that alcohol gives you, and if you miss that feeling, what stops you from not taking that drug? I mean, why is it that you don't wake up some mornings and you're intending to continue on your road towards recovery, as you intended many times during COVID and earlier to do so? But just as in those earlier instances, you wake up thinking, today I'm not going to drink, and then by noon you say, I'm going to drink. Why in this case, is it so hard to say, I'm not going to go and reach for a bottle of beer, but it's somehow easier to say, I am going to take this pill?
Yeah. So compliance is an issue with this drug for sure. There's a long-acting form called Vivitrol. It's a shot in the butt. You get it once a month. And so for people who have trouble with compliance, that can be a sort of good alternative. For me, I knew that the other options were worse. And my life had become, as they say in AA, my life had become so unmanageable that this was the last best option. And so I was committed to it. And honestly, I think that if I had tried this at 25, I don't think I would have been able to do it. But I was not 25. I was in my late 30s, early 40s. I wasn't drinking socially at the time. This was during COVID. I was alone at home, and I had ceased to get much pleasure from alcohol. The anticipation and fulfilling the craving was pleasurable. And the first few drinks, there would be elements of pleasure. But by the third drink, I was really only drinking to try to recapture the feeling of the first drink, or even the feeling before the first drink, the feeling of, all right, I have a craving and I'm going to fulfill it, and that feels good. And I knew that. And to me, I think I had just reached a point in my life where it was like, if I don't do this, it's eventually going to kill me, and I don't want to die. But yeah, compliance can absolutely be an issue for this drug. And so after talking to a lot of people who have done the Sinclair method, and there's other ways to take naltrexone, but the book is about this particular modality for the most part. It can be it's most effective for people who are highly motivated, also people who have some social support, who have work. This is not going to be a miracle cure for somebody who lives on the street, whose life is really unstable, who has trouble finding housing or food or alcohol. For people like that, I talked to a guy who works in public health, and he said for his patients, Vivitrol can be effective in terms of reducing drinking because it's a shot, right? You get the shot. If they show up to get the shot, it can be effective. But for his clients, something that requires you to take your pill, wait an hour, set your timer, wait an hour, and then drink is just not going to work.
It's not going to help, yeah.
Right. And I asked him...
I guess there is a structural difference as well, where the structure of a problem with not drinking is you have to not drink at 10 a.m. and you have to not drink at 11 a.m. You have to not drink at 12 p.m. and you have to not drink at 1 p.m., right? You have to have perfect compliance throughout the day and in the kind of AA framework every day.
Yeah.
And messing up once scuppers the whole scheme. with taking this medicine, on the daily basis, it's just you have to have one moment of self-control.
Right.
Right? As long as at 10 a.m. or at 11 a.m. or at 12 p.m. or at 1 p.m. you have a moment of self-control.
So it's a little bit more complex than that because it is very possible to drink through the naltrexone. So the half-life of the drug, it depends on your particular metabolism and biology, but ranges like 5-6 hours. And so it is very possible to drink through it. And anecdotally, it seems like there are some drinks, some forms of alcohol that make people more likely to drink through the drug, like vodka. People who are heavy vodka drinkers typically have an easier time drinking through it. And so what some people do is they redose, right? You redose after 5 or 6 hours. That takes willpower, especially if you've been drinking for 5 or 6 hours and you're half loaded and you got to make the good choice. That is hard to do. But by the time people get to a place where they're taking naltrexone, where they're doing the Sinclair method, from my experience, talking to a lot of people who have done this, they are desperate for change. They are so ready. They mostly have tried other stuff and it hasn't worked. And so if you are desperate for change and the only thing that you have to do is take your pill, people do it. Not everybody, for sure. Like, again, compliance is for sure an issue, and this will not work for people who are sort of half-assed on compliance. Even I've talked to people who the term is called reaching extinction, is sort of the end goal of the Sinclair method. And this is it's a term in psychology, as I'm sure you know, Yascha, that just means basically unlearning a behavior. And so once you have reached extinction, which under the Sinclair method basically means you lose the desire, the compulsion to drink. And some people do
retrained your brain so that it's no longer expecting pleasure from drinking.
Exactly. Once you've reached extinction, some people, like me, just stop drinking entirely. Some people continue to drink moderately. And I have talked to people who reached extinction. They felt free from this monkey on their back, and then but they continued to drink moderately, and they got lax on waiting the full hour. So they kept taking the pill, but they got lax on waiting the full hour, and they very quickly slid back into alcoholism and have to start the process all over again.
So tell us about where you're at in this journey. You hinted at the fact that obviously this worked for you, and that it does seem to have led to the good kind of quote unquote extinction in this case. So tell us about what that process looked like, and when you decided to not just tell your wife and many of your friends and family members, but to write a book about this and go public with this whole journey.
Yeah. So I once I started this, I was very regimented about it. And it took and there are all sorts of, one of the reasons I wrote the books is because it seems it's sort of deceptively simple. You take the pill, you wait an hour, and then you drink. But there are all sorts of kind of small changes that people can make along the way that will increase their likelihood of success. And I should say, this is not a miracle pill. Like, it does not work for everybody for a combination of reasons, including some that are just straight up biological that you have no control over. But for me, so I started taking the pill, and I very regimented about it. I'm going to take the pill. I'm going to wait an hour. I'm going to drink. Over time, I should also say, so one of the differences between the Sinclair method and sort of the typical way that a doctor might prescribe this drug is that you only take naltrexone when you are drinking. So you do not take it on alcohol-free days. And the reason for that is because on those days when your endorphin receptors are unblocked, you want to fill your days, if you can, with things that bring sort of healthy pleasures, right? So that's part of relearning life sober. Things like having a good meal or going for a jog, if that brings you pleasure, or playing with your dog or your kids or whatever it is. You want to find new coping mechanisms and also retrain your brain to find pleasure in non-alcoholic things, right? And so I started, over that 7 months, I was tracking my drinking. This is another key part of the process. And at the beginning, I was drinking basically just as much as I had been. The experience of drinking on naltrexone was less pleasurable. I've heard it described as like eating 4-day-old cake or riding a bike with a flat tire or drinking with a condom on. Like, you're still doing the thing. You're still doing the act. It's just not as fun. And you can still get drunk. it's just, you don't get the sort of euphoric buzz that comes with alcohol, or that I get from alcohol. Not everybody gets that. I wasn't getting that sort of energetic high. I was getting kind of the body effects of alcohol, where you feel slurry and a little sleepy, but it wasn't counterbalanced with that euphoria. So I did that for 7 months, and over, within the first month or so, my drinking didn't change that much. I was tracking it, so I could see on a chart how much I was drinking. And then I started increasing the number of alcohol-free days. Or I actually, before I started that, I started pushing back my start time. So instead of starting at noon, I would start at 3, and then later at 4 or whatever. And then I started increasing the number of alcohol-free days I had every week. And that in itself was, like, I had never done that before. I had never had alcohol-free days when I was like I had alcohol-free days all the time when my wife was around, but when she wasn't working, but I never had alcohol-free days if I was just like left to my own devices and I could do whatever I wanted. I was going to drink. And so I started increasing those and finding things to do that were not alcoholic, going for walks with my dog in the woods, whatever it was, paddleboarding, just finding ways to fill up my time. I started working more. And so I did this for 7 months, sort of decreasing the amount of alcohol, increasing the number of alcohol-free days. And then after 7 months, I said, all right, I'm going to challenge myself to 30 days without drinking. And it was shockingly easy, something that before had always been so...
It would have felt completely daunting and impossible.
I think I had one, in almost 20 years, I think I had one period of having a fully alcohol-free month, and it was a huge challenge. And of course, I celebrated it afterward with a bender, and it was easy. Like, I didn't even think about alcohol. And so that took 7 months, and then I just never started again. And I declared sort of myself officially extinct after 9 months after starting. So 2 months after 7 months of doing the protocol, 2 months of sobriety, I said, okay, this is it. I'm done. I've reached extinction. And then I just never started drinking again. So I no longer take the pill because I no longer drink. And
so at this point, you're at a wedding and there's a toast with champagne. You don't toast, or you toast with champagne and have a couple of sips?
No, I don't drink at all. And if I wanted to drink, I would need to take a pill. Like, it would be, I still have all of the risk factors. My life has changed. I have new coping mechanisms, and I'm in some ways a different person. In some ways I'm exactly the same, but in some ways my life is very different. But I think my particular risk factors, biology, make me a high risk candidate for alcohol use disorder no matter what. And so I think it's a slippery slope, right? I could take that sip of champagne and I would be fine that day, but it would trigger something in my brain. Oh, you like this, right? And so for me, it's just easier not to drink at all, in part because I don't like taking naltrexone. For some people who don't have any sort of side effects, like naltrexone is just absolutely no big deal, and they want to continue to drink moderately, and that works for them, and I think that's completely fine. Just for me, like, the pleasure that I get from drinking on naltrexone is not worth the side effects. And the side effects were not prohibitive, but I don't really like it. It's an endorphin blocker. It doesn't feel good, or doesn't feel great. So I just don't drink at all now. And the thing that's the most surprising about this is that I actually can have a good time without alcohol. I can, it's like this thing that I thought was impossible because I had never done it before, because I started drinking so long. It's completely fine. I enjoy it. I enjoy going to dinner parties and not drinking. I enjoy going to parties and not drinking. Whatever it is, it has so little mental pull on me that everybody around me can be drinking, and I don't get jealous. I don't get resentful. I don't get cravings. I feel completely free of that mental burden.
Congratulations! I mean,
Thank you.
I'm very happy for you, and it is a very compelling and touching story you tell. Tell me about where we're at with the culture on this. I mean, I think even about in many ways a less emotionally charged topic like smoking and vaping. It's not exactly analogous. There's some differences, right? But there's a real question where people are addicted to smoking, and it's obviously very bad for their health and a huge risk factor for cancer and other cardiovascular disease and everything else. And so you might think, well, let's encourage this alternative which gives some of the same pleasures, but without most of the negative impact that smoking has, which doesn't come mostly from nicotine, but from other ingredients of cigarettes. Actually, some regulations are tougher on vaping than they are on smoking. And there's a very strong sense in parts of the public health landscape that is absolutely the wrong thing to do, because we're just going to, at a time when we're managing to reduce how much people smoke, etc., we're just going to encourage a whole new generation of people to get addicted to something that perhaps isn't quite as bad, but is still bad. And, we shouldn't engage in kind of harm reduction of that sort. I'm sure that there's similar pushback against the Sinclair method. That there's a bunch of people who say, this is just going to tempt people into excuses to keep drinking, or, it's not going to be as effective. And, wherever possible, we need to continue to encourage people to quit cold turkey, and that's the only thing that's really going to work at scale. What's the evidence for the effectiveness of these different sets of interventions? To what extent is public health coming around to this? To what extent are doctors starting to at least learn about the existence of the Sinclair method? Tell us about the debate over this and where you stand in it.
Yeah, so things are changing, I think, pretty rapidly. And one thing that I think will surprise people to hear is that naltrexone has been FDA approved for the treatment of alcohol use disorder for over 30 years. So this is not a new drug. It was actually initially developed to treat opioid use disorder. So it's been around for over 30 years, and yet there's been pretty small uptake for any sort of medication-assisted treatment for alcohol use disorder. So there are 3 drugs that are currently FDA approved to treat alcoholism. This one, a drug called Campril, and or Camprosate, and Antabuse, which is a drug that basically makes you very ill if you drink it. And then there are all sorts of off-label drugs that are used, Ozempic also being one, or GLP-1s that are getting a lot of attention for the sort of, one of the side effects of taking this drug is that people report that they have really diminished cravings for things like not just food, but also for alcohol, gambling, any sort of, maybe not any, but for many sort of behavioral addictions or substance addictions.
I have an acquaintance who's an accomplished poker player and who says that when he started to take Ozempic or one of the other GLP-1s, his poker playing improved. And
it improved.
The reason why he thought it did that is that, he knows about probabilities and all of those things. But there's situations where you could kind of do either. You can go all in or you can fold, and he had trouble getting himself to do the statistically optimal thing. It's much more fun to go all in than to fold. And just in those kind of edge cases, he thinks that he's now better able to fold rather than to go all in. And he keeps quite close track of his poker playing. And he thinks since he started taking GLP-1s, there's a very clear pattern in the data that he just became a better player at that point.
Oh, that's really interesting. Yeah, GLP-1s are fascinating. I don't know much about them, but they do seem to be very promising when it comes to an array of addictive behaviors. I wonder if they'll eventually be considered performance-enhancing drugs for poker and gambling and things like that. But naltrexone has been around for a long time, and it has been studied to death, sort of. There have been over 100 clinical trials for naltrexone all over the world. The Sinclair method is less studied. If you search the Sinclair method in PubMed, you would find basically nothing. If you search targeted use of naltrexone, you're going to find more studies. It's basically the same thing. I think there's sort of interesting. John David Sinclair, who developed this, he had a PhD, then he finished his PhD, then he went over to Finland and worked for Alko Laboratories, which was basically the Finnish alcohol distributor that was also, they hired researchers to basically work on minimizing the harm caused by the things that they were also selling. And so he worked not in private industry, but for the government. And I do think there's this sort of, you might be familiar with, there's a little bit of snobbery within academia about sort of his protocol. So the thing that I studied is the targeted use of naltrexone. And this has been studied not nearly as much as just naltrexone when prescribed daily. So the most recent study on the targeted use of naltrexone, this was just from a couple years ago, or the most recent one that I'm aware of, This was a very specific population that they looked at. They looked at gay men in San Francisco who had mild to moderate alcohol use disorder. They gave them the drug, and they found that over the course of 6 months, their alcohol consumption had decreased by 30%. So this has been well studied. There is, historically, I think there's been more resistance to using medication-assisted therapy than there is now, in large part because of the opioid crisis, because there has been this acknowledgement that the sort of gold standard to get people off of opioids, this thing that has killed actually fewer people than alcohol every year, but has killed a lot of people and some very tragic stories. And we can all see sort of the effects of the opioid crisis on American streets. I don't know how New York is, but in Seattle, you see it. Even I don't live in Seattle anymore, but like in the small town where I live, when you go to a park, there are people sleeping in the park, and they're not just taking naps, right? But the gold standard for opioid addiction is Suboxone. This is the thing that is most likely to work for people. And I think it's very hard to will your way out of a fentanyl addiction, right? And it's so deadly that I think public health authorities have been forced to basically reframe how they think about treating addiction. And so there's been more of an uptake within public health authorities. This was true during the Biden administration. It might be less true during the Trump administration. And even rehab centers like Hazelden and Betty Ford that were traditionally very resistant to using medication-assisted therapy for addiction have started using them in the last 10 years or so. So there has been a shift. It's pretty slow though. So if you look at statistics, something like for the past 10 years, something like an average of all of the people who qualify for treatment for alcohol use disorder, that's about 10% of the American population. Less than 2% of those people will be prescribed any kind of medication to treat their condition. This year, over the past year, the statistics just recently came out, and that statistic went from just under 2% to 2.5%. So still a very small percentage of the overall population, but also a significant jump from the year before. So I think this is shifting very quickly. And there are other programs that seem to be working for people. Like I keep getting ads for this app called Reframe. And it's I think it's based on sort of principles of cognitive behavioral therapy. I'm not totally sure how it works, but I hear from people in my life who are using this app to moderate their drinking. And so I think at this point we are moving away from like there's only one path out of this, and it's abstinence only.
To recognizing that there's a range of interventions that can work.
Yes. And in some ways that's sort of a reversion to an earlier time, because there have been many, many treatments throughout history, both for detoxing from alcohol and for long-term, or at least there have been attempts for long-term treatment programs. Some of them are absolutely bizarre, like aversion therapies where you drink so much alcohol that it nearly kills you, things like that. There was a treatment somewhere in Scandinavia where all of your clothes, like not just your diet was like whiskey based, but all of your clothing would be like, and bedding would be soaked in alcohol in an attempt to like force you to hate this thing.
Wow.
There's also been, of course, lots of quacks and like purported miracle cures, that some of which actually do work for some people.
That feels like sort of 1960s parenting methods, where if somebody caught you with a cigarette, they would make you smoke 2 packs immediately, and they try to get you to desist. Which
probably does work for some people. So I find that sort of hopeful.
And other people immediately become chain smokers in that particular case. I imagine that among the listeners to this podcast, there are people who perhaps at that stage of so what do you call it? We'll cut this. The recognition that comes in and out.
Vacillating denial.
Oh yeah,
and that's not a term that I came up with. I read that somewhere.
Okay. I imagine that among the listeners of this podcast, there must be some people who are at this stage of vacillating denial, and who tune into this podcast not to learn how to confront the problems they have in their lives, but to learn about politics and other things that we tend to talk about here.
Yeah.
but who perhaps have listened to this conversation with a sinking feeling that some of your story runs parallel to theirs, and perhaps with a little bit of hope in the last 20 or 30 minutes that they might be able to follow your path out of it. What would you say to people who are in that position? What does it take to confront the problem? And if how should they figure out whether to go to AA or whether to try the Sinclair method? And if they want to try the Sinclair method, how should they go about doing that?
Yeah, so that's a tough question to answer, and I think it comes down to the individual, right? I think that it's sort of like being gay, right? You kind of know if you have a problem. But again, there are many people in the world who very clearly have a problem from the outside and who live in complete denial. That's one of the first steps of AA is that you recognize that you are powerless over alcohol. I think there are even sort of, for lack of a better term, like there are like quizzes you can take online. There are evaluations that you can do from public health authorities that ask you probing questions. Has alcohol interfered with school, with work, with your relationships? How much are you drinking? To me, I think if you are unhappy with the amount that you are drinking and what alcohol is doing to your life, that's a fairly clear sign that this is something that you might want to change. And in terms of, the various approaches to it, the Sinclair method tends to work well for some people and not work at all for other people. And there are a few reasons for this, some of which are purely biological, as I said earlier. And absent a sort of genetic test, there are some genetic indicators that.
So it's just that for some people this drug makes them not enjoy alcohol, and others can take the drug and it doesn't really affect the pleasure they get from alcohol. Is that basically it?
Yes, for some people they'll have no effect whatsoever. It's as though they haven't taken it. And so there's a couple predictors for whether or not it's going to work. And one of those is the effect that you get from drinking, right? So to simplify this, and to generalize, there are basically two types of drinkers. And I got this information from a clinician and researcher named Joe Volpicelli. He's sort of the godfather of naltrexone. Some of his studies were used for the FDA approval for naltrexone. He's been studying this drug for many decades. So Joe explained it like this. So there are reward drinkers and relief drinkers. Reward drinkers are people who get energized from alcohol, right? So you get this endorphin dump, you get buzzed, you get high, you feel energized. It's like, for me, like drinking alcohol is almost like taking caffeine or a stimulant, right? Alcohol, for me, has the effect of making me more energetic, not less. Later, after I've had 7 or 8 drinks, I'm gonna pass out. But in the beginning, that sort of initial rush of feeling is one of high energy. So those are reward drinkers. The other type of drinker are relief drinkers, and those are people who get a sedating effect from alcohol. So these are people who might drink because they have a lot of anxiety, and drinking calms them down. So naltrexone...
I'm probably hugely oversimplifying what is already a formulation meant to make it graspable for people. But when I'm picturing the first one, it's the person who goes out to the bar and has a beer to socialize. And the other one is the sort of wine mom, right, who's like... whose children are getting on her nerves, and she just needs a glass of wine at the end of the day to steady her nerves.
Yes, and it can be hard to sort of figure out which type you are. And to complicate things further, some people have elements of both. So this is complex. We're like really simplifying this here. But if you just think about the effect that drinking has on you, that might be a good indication for whether or not naltrexone is going to have an effect. Now, another indication is...
And I presume it works if you're the first type, the one who goes out to the bar and gets a buzz from alcohol, exactly. Not with it if it's the second type.
It almost turns the first drinker, this is what Joe told me, it turns the first type of drinker into the second type of drinker. You get the sedating effect. You get a little sleepy on naltrexone. You don't get energized. You don't feel wild. You don't want to go out and, swim in the fountain at the mall or whatever. You just get kind of down, right? So naltrexone tends to work well.
I wanted to swim in a fountain until I heard it was at the mall, but that's...
You probably don't have malls in Germany. At least not cool indoor ones.
Nowadays you have malls everywhere, but the fountain malls are cooler in the States than in Germany. Other kinds of fountains are perhaps more cool in Europe than in the States.
So naltrexone can be really effective for that first type of drinker and can have almost zero effect on the second type of drinker, which is, it's a fascinating drug. And so, that's one thing to sort of just have a little bit of introspection. What kind of drinker am I? Do I think that I have a problem? Is alcohol taking up more space in my life than I want it to? And am I unhappy with the amount that I'm drinking? And then what kind of drinker am I? And I think for people who are interested in naltrexone, I highly recommend that people talk to experts. There are now clinicians who specialize in this. So because of COVID, there's been this rise of telemedicine. And so now, basically anyone who goes to medical school today is going to learn about naltrexone. That would not have been true a generation ago. But now everyone who goes through a psych rotation learns about these drugs for treating alcohol use disorder. This is a huge, and this is a really big change, a really important one. So doctors are more informed about these various drugs, but there are specialists who really focus on naltrexone. There's a company called Aura. You basically just Google Sinclair method or naltrexone, and you can find providers who will do a telemedicine appointment with you. They'll do an evaluation and will send you the drugs in the mail. There are also coaches. So this isn't something I did. I did this in secret with basically no support other than talking to people about it on Facebook and then reporting on it, interviewing other people who had done it. But there are coaches who can really help you through the peaks and the valleys, because this is not one thing that's really important for people to realize, is that this is not a linear process. So when you chart your drinks, your chart is going to have spikes and it's going to have valleys. Almost nobody takes this one time and then just quits drinking. It takes time and a commitment. And there are things that you need to be just basically prepared, so that if you go through a honeymoon period and then all of a sudden you're drinking spikes, you know to expect that. And a lot of this stuff is in the book. This is why I wrote the book, in part because a lot of this information I had to sort of piece it together when I was doing it through social media, through Reddit, through Facebook, through YouTube. And I wanted there to be sort of an easy place for people to go to know what to expect on day one, on month one, on year one. But there are people who do this for a living, and who have done it themselves and are just so helpful when it comes to dealing with the barriers that come up, because this is not a completely painless process, right? It sounds easy, take a pill and then have a beer, but I don't think I've talked to anybody who didn't face some sort of resistance or hardship while doing this.
So if you want the details of how to go through this process, read the book. Perhaps the last question: you did this in secret, and you obviously managed to hide the fact that you had this problem for a very long time. Finding the courage to try and tell yourself, I'm going to change my life, must have been very hard. But telling people that you're doing this, that you're solving a problem that they didn't know you had, must have been very hard as well. At what point were you prepared to do that? And what has been the reaction of your friends, of your family, of your wife?
So I told my wife it was over a year, maybe even 2 years after I actually stopped drinking. And I think to some people that sounds absolutely crazy. It sounds crazy to them that my wife didn't know, but I promise you there are many people who drink in secret and are able to keep it a secret. She's not. The one thing that has been sort of angering about this is I've had people sort of assume that my wife is very gullible or not observant. It's not true. Nobody knew that I was drinking. Nobody, including people I'm very close to. This is not a failure on her part. This is a failure on my part, really. But I waited a year and a half until I actually quit drinking to tell her. And when I told her, she was, absolutely shocked, but she was also proud that I had done this and come through at the other side, that I had a problem and I solved it. And our lives got so much better over the course of my sobriety. Just things like when we bought our first house, I was still drinking, and I didn't help with the paperwork, right? So like getting your paperwork, there's a lot of paperwork involved in buying a house, just shit like that. So like I wasn't on our first loan because I didn't have the like capacity to find my old W-2s and stuff like that. After I got sober, we bought a house and I did all the paperwork, just stuff like that, where like I was able to take responsibility for things that before would have been pretty impossible. So I think she was, she sort of had probably noticed that things were different, but hadn't articulated to herself what was different. I was healthier, looked better, happier, less anxiety. I wasn't, waking up at 3:00 in the morning. But she was shocked when I told her. And then the reason I decided to, and so I told her, and then I thought, I just don't have to tell anybody ever again. Like I've told the most important person in my life, this can continue to be a secret. But, as I told you, I came of age in heavy drinking communities. And over the years, as I have aged and people in those communities have also aged, a lot of them have died. And I see the effects of alcohol abuse all around me. And I started to just feel so guilty that I had found this thing that probably saved my life, and I was unwilling to publicly acknowledge it or even privately acknowledge it because I didn't want people to know about my story. And I felt guilty. I felt really like all of the shame that I felt during my drinking days. That had sort of transmuted into shame about my unwillingness to like put my name and face to this. I have a fairly high profile and within some circles. And I know there are people who follow me, who listen to my show or read my work, who suffer from the same problem. And I had this thing, all I had to do was tweet, like, Google the Sinclair method. It saved my life. And I could have helped other people, and I was unwilling to do that. And then my friend Andy Mills, who he's a podcast producer, and Andy was one of the few people I had told that I was doing this because Andy he worked for Radiolab, and he had done a show on the Sinclair method, like at this point, like 10 or 12 years ago. And when I was doing this and researching it, I found that show. And so I knew Andy would understand. So I told Andy what I was doing. And then Andy was launching a new show, and he wanted the first episode of his show, it's called Reflector, to be about the Sinclair method. And so he came to me and he said, like, can you help me find some people who'll talk to me about this? And I thought, I could help Andy, or I could just do it myself. And part of it was selfish. I just thought, like, someday this is gonna take off, I think. And I don't want to kind of be like left behind because I was unwilling to put my name to it. So part of it was completely selfish. And part of it was also, this thing saved my life. I really, really believe that, or at least it made my life better. And I just thought by gatekeeping, gatekeeping a solution to this thing that kills 170,000 Americans every year, I'm doing something pretty unethical here because I want to like save face about it. So that was kind of what happened.
Well, thank you for managing to save your own life, because we need you in the culture, and I enjoy your writing and your podcast beyond this book. And thank you for gathering the courage to help other people face their problem.
Well, thanks for having me, Yascha. It's great to talk to you.